this job. And I've always taken him as kind of a role model because of his just incredibly hard work and outstanding production as an academic and as a human being. So while maintaining a teaching load of 4 classes per semester on average and mentoring numerous students, he has managed to publish 4 outstanding award-winning books and numerous articles in prestigious journals. I mean, I just can't emphasize how really, just how not easy that task is. If I can publish even 1 book in 10 years' time, I consider myself lucky with the teaching load and the mentoring load that we have here. So 4 in, how long have you been here, Christopher?
10 years.
10 years. It's just an amazing accomplishment, if you ask me. And that these books are award-winning books. His book, The Colored Cartoon, was honored by the Association of College and Research Libraries as an outstanding academic title in 2008. His most recent book, Slavery in the Upper Mississippi Valley, 1787 to 1865, documents the persistence of slavery in Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin through the end of the Civil War. So that's a part of the history of migration in this country that he's going to be sharing with us today. His lecture for today is the African American history of historical experience in Minnesota as migrants in the 19th century. So with no further ado, would you please give me a warm round of applause for Dr. Christopher Lehman.
I'd like to start by thanking you all for attending the conference and for attending my speech. And I'd like to thank Dr. Gilliam for the invitation for me to speak today. And I also give my thanks to all professors who sent your students to see me speak this morning. My speech today will evolve from the general to the specific. I present the argument this morning that Minnesota experienced 4 major waves of African American migration from the 18th century to the 1930s. The first wave was in the Midwest at large. The second wave was also regional, but it manifested itself in Minnesota in a unique manner to the rest of the Midwest. The third wave largely concerns the Twin Cities in central Minnesota. And the fourth wave has to do exclusively with central Minnesota, especially St. Cloud. I have studied the migration of African Americans to St. Cloud for the past 9 years, and mythology about this migration inspired my research. My wife, who also is African American, gave a speech in the city about 9 years ago, and when she welcomed comments, an audience member, who my wife says was about in her 40s, declared that St. Cloud was just fine before you people came along. So the historian in me, I used to be a history major, wanted to know exactly when it was that my people came along. And I was expecting, based on this person's age, for it to have been in the 1960s or so. But it did not take me a whole lot of time at the Stearns History Museum here in town to learn that the year was 1854, which is 2 years before St. Cloud was actually an incorporated city. So either the woman was older than my wife had thought, according to her memory of St. Cloud before African Americans, or she did not really know the migration history. So it's that history that I'll be presenting to you, starting with the first immigration wave, which is the French colonial slaves. In the 18th century, African slavery took place in the Midwest because the French introduced it upon colonizing the region. Within North America, France created the colony of Louisiana in 1717. 2 years later, France brought 500 Africans from Guinea, who were enslaved within the southern part of the territory. That same year, 1719, Philip Francis Renault imported 500 other slaves into northern Louisiana, which later became the Northwest Territory of the United States. So many of the French expatriated Africans to North America that by 1750, along the Mississippi River, they had created 5 new slavery-based settlements, known as Kaskaskia, Keokuk, Fort Chartres, St. Philippe, and Prairie du Rocher. 13 years later, the transfer of power within Louisiana Territory precipitated a temporary decline in the practice of slavery in the upper Mississippi. At the time, a significant number of African slaves still lived and labored in northern Louisiana. However, in 1763, the French transferred control of the land to the British. Still, the transfer alone did not cause the decline because the British did not call for the end of slavery. Rather, many of the French colonists decided to leave the territory because they did not want to be under the rule of a new power. The slave population did not increase again until settlers from Britain's 13 colonies in North America began bringing their Africans to the Louisiana Territory at the end of the 18th century. From the start, slavery in the Northwest Territory was unique among slave communities in the Americas. In the lower portion of the Louisiana Territory, the strict enforcement of the slave code made the lives of African slaves almost unbearable. In contrast, the slaves of the Northwest Territory experienced slightly more control over their own lives. The owners did not witness much enforcement of the rules by a mayor commandant appointed by the governor of New Orleans. As a result, the first slaveholders of the upper Mississippi exerted relatively autonomous control over the management of their plantations. In addition, because few planters in the area owned as many as 4 African American slaves, slavery in the Northwest Territory was little more than a patriarchal enterprise. Most of the slaveholders there fed their slaves relatively well. The master-slave relations were generally not violent. The owners gave their slaves special privileges on every Sunday and holiday, and enslaved children received instruction on the catechism, according to the ordinance of King Louis XIV in 1724, which mandated that all masters teach their slaves of the apostolic Catholic religion and provide baptisms for them. The slaveholders worked alongside the male slaves, and female slaves accompanied their mistresses to matins and vespers. The owners allowed the slaves to participate in various public festivities as well. The Revolutionary War that took place to the east of Louisiana Territory did little to disrupt slavery in the Midwest at the time. Only after the outcome of the conflict did the war relate to the future of slavery in the area. In 1783, the United States won independence from Britain after 8 years of war. As part of the new nation's process in creating a new government and laws, the United States settled the question of whether the Northwest Territory should have slavery or not. The country's founders did not come to an immediate solution. It took 4 years for them to think of one. On July 13, 1787, the 6th article of the Northwest Ordinance became federal law. It read, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory," Northwest Territory, "otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any person escaping into the same, from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed, in any one of the original states, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her service as aforesaid." With this ordinance, abolitionists could take heart in having won a major victory, in that their government was voluntarily restricting slavery, instead of allowing the practice to spread throughout any new territories that the United States acquired. The new law also pleased Southern legislators by not prohibiting slavery in land below the Ohio River. However, the Midwestern slaves themselves were on the losing end of the deal, because the ordinance allowed the settlers who were already in the upper Mississippi to keep their Africans enslaved, just as they had done for nearly 80 years. Still, debate continued among Americans about what the ordinance meant. Some migrants thought that the new law banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, but others thought slavery could still legally take place there. For those in the second group, their proof lay in the language of the law. The ordinance mentioned free inhabitants and the free male inhabitants of full size, and the distinguishing of free people meant to the pro-slavery people that not all people in the jurisdiction of the law were to be considered free. In addition, the practice of slavery was not uniform to the territory because 3 kinds of slaves existed there. The French, who were still in the area, enslaved their Africans. The British, who came to the territory after the French, brought their own Africans. In both their cases, any of the banning of their slaves would have been retroactive. The fastest growing segment of slaveholders there consisted of U.S. citizens migrating to the Northwest. The ordinance's ban on slavery applied directly to them. Not everyone in the federal government considered African Americans to ultimately be free there. Despite the ordinance, at least one of the members of Congress sought to clarify that only certain kinds of slaves in the Northwest Territory were freed under the law. A congressional committee headed by future President James Madison concluded that Congress had not meant for the 6th article to totally ban slavery. Rather, the federal government granted the territory the authority to protect its residents' ownership of human chattel. Madison, moreover, considered the migration of slaveholders and slaves to the Northwest a crucial development. and lessening not only racial tensions, but also physical abuse of slaves, and people's concerns about the aftermath of the freeing of slaves. As much as the expansion of slavery benefited the nation, said Madison, slaves stood to benefit more than twice as much concerning both their prospects of emancipation and their condition in the meantime. European immigrants and their governments helped continue African slavery in Northwest Territory after the ordinance was passed. Fewer French and British people settled there with their slaves after the United States won the Revolutionary War. The numbers further decreased after the ordinance took effect because they faced intense hostility from the growing number of anti-slavery migrants into the territory after the law's passage. The slaveholders who remained, however, established their permanence with settlements. The French residents of the northwest communities of Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and Vincennes along the Wabash River kept their slaves where they lived. The British Empire, meanwhile, supplied Canadians in the territory with African slaves. Although the ordinance protected their slaves, the French grew concerned for the safety of their human property. In 1789, Congressman Bartholomew Tardivaux asked his fellow legislators to pass a constitutional amendment that specifically declared that the ordinance of 1787 had not freed the slaves of the territory. Tardivaux represented the pro-slavery interests of the French settlers who were already there. The arguing about slavery in Northwest Territory resulted in part from the federal government's absence of leadership on the issue. At the time, the Constitution had displaced all previous federal laws, including those that were passed under the Articles of Confederation. The new document did not specifically address the territory or slavery in it. As a result, the federal government had no official policy in operation concerning the institution in Northwest Territory. Tardivaux sought to rectify the dilemma by having Congress draft and pass a definitive statement on where the federal government stood on the matter of slavery in the Midwest, especially a pro-slavery declaration. But instead, Congress made no statement at all. Meanwhile, the population of the area evolved over time. A Creole population in the Midwest formed. Europeans, Africans, and indigenous people engaged in sexual relationships with one another. By the start of the 19th century, the Midwest was populated with families of multi-ethnic people. In addition, their African heritage did not prohibit them from being considered free. For example, a European American man married a woman of African heritage and adopted her children. In the 1810 census, the husband was listed as white, but his wife and children were black. However, in the 1820 census, all of the family members were identified as white. Traveler Caleb Atwater revealed that European Americans there had some sexual relations with slaves, among other groups of people. He witnessed that activity for himself at a gathering he hosted for all the respectable part of the people in Garrison and in the village. He noted that the invited guests were inside the council house during the party and consisted of civilized persons of both sexes, as polished and as refined in their manners, as well-bred and educated as well too as any persons in the United States. Outside the building, however, a motley group of creatures held its own party. Atwater identified them ethnically as a mixed breed, and probably more mixed than any other human beings in the world, each one consisting of Negro, Indian, French, English, American, Scotch, Irish, and Spanish blood. He acknowledged that French colonization of the upper Mississippi led to the development of that particular community of people. The Negro, therefore, was most likely a reference to any African slaves that the colonists owned. In addition, Atwater's reference to the outsiders as a group revealed that the sexual encounters had taken place often enough to have provided a community of people with a multi-ethnic heritage that so intensely disgusted him. As with others of that time period who lamented this miscegenation, he failed to mention the role played by the Europeans for European Americans in the forming of the mixed breed. Despite the probability that some of the motley people shared ancestors with the civilized and respectable guests, Atwater refused to recognize the former group as people. "I can scarcely call them human beings," he sneered before joking. "I should rather suspect some of them to be a little touched with the prairie wolf." The end of his anecdote devolved into ethnic stereotypes, unfounded accusations, and hyperbole. He argued that they possessed the vices and faults of each and all the above named nations and animals, without even one redeeming virtue. But he failed to mention a single character flaw, and to which nationality or animal it belonged. Then returning to the theme of the Midwest as an untamed land, he lamented that you were on the very confines of civilized and savage life. Atwater's story clearly delineated which people lived which life, in his opinion. His feelings were representative of Americans who were accustomed to more stratified relationships with people according to skin color. As more people sharing his viewpoint entered the Northwest Territory, the culture of slavery there changed. And this brings me to the second immigration wave, which is Americans who are from the South who are bringing their African American slaves with them to the Midwest. In 1820, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery above the 3630 parallel. The Northwest Territory was part of the area in which slavery now became illegal. Still, American presidents broke that law in order to supply the Midwest with governors and with soldiers for the many ports that were in the area. When Andrew Jackson served as president in the 1820s and 30s, his decisions about which soldiers to assign to the upper Mississippi and where in the region to station them dramatically influenced whether the Midwest would become friendly or hostile to slavery. President Jackson's choices to assign slaveholders meant that at least during his tenure in office, slavery was acceptable by virtue of the servicemen's popular sovereignty. His own ownership of slaves while leading the nation made more likely his support of the expansion of slavery into the Midwest. The vagueness concerning slavery in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, reflected the status of the mission's commanding officer, Colonel Zachary Taylor, as a slaveholder. He and his wife were unique among upper Mississippi slaveholders in that their slaves performed agricultural labor, which was a contrast to the domestic work that most of the slaves in the Midwest performed. Zachary Taylor and his wife brought 2 domestic slaves from Louisville, Kentucky to Prairie du Chien when President Jackson appointed him to supervise military defense at Fort Crawford against the Ho-Chunk people. The names of Taylor's slaves were Will and Sally, and they helped Taylor's wife in her household duties. She directed them to help her skim the milk and feed the chickens, among other chores. Slaveholders came to Minnesota Territory for various reasons. Southerners stayed during the summer months for the cooler climate, but not simply for enjoyment, but also to escape malarial fever. The territory was very democratic. In Congress, territorial representatives and Southern Democrats were friends. Some Minnesota legislators tried to capitalize on these demographics and pass some pro-slavery legislation. They attempted to push through a law allowing Southerners to bring slaves to the territory 6 months out of the year. The Mississippi River also connected Minnesota Territory with the South, which provided those below the Mason-Dixon line with easy access to the Midwest. Many entrepreneurs came to Minnesota Territory to build businesses from the territory's popularity with Southerners. Some of them were not even from the South, nor had they lived there for any considerable length of time. Nevertheless, they knew that some of their Southern patrons were sensitive to how Northerners would receive them if slaves were to accompany them. The entrepreneurs, therefore, promised to preserve their potential customers' Southern lifestyles as much as possible. One such businessman, James Winslow, was born in Vermont and came to Minnesota in 1852 to make money from slaveholders. Winslow's vision took 4 years and a considerable amount of money to bring to fruition. He hired Robert Alden to design the Winslow House Hotel. It was a 5-story, $110,000 hotel of Nicollet Island limestone. Inside were 200 guest rooms, a lavish ballroom, and $60,000 in settings. The waterfall was audible from inside. By 1856, construction was completed and the hotel opened. James Winslow built the hotel partly, if not solely, to cater to the Southerners and their African-American slaves. Even when advertising to a particular region, however, he prioritized a particular economic class. The hotel housed vacationing, wealthy, and fashionable Southerners during the summers, which meant that poor yeoman farmers with few to no slaves could not afford to stay there. By and large, big planters were the Southern clientele. As one settler remembered, ladies old and young, plainly dressed and accompanied by their colored servants and nurses, each with goblet or drinking cup of some description in hand, wending their way to the springs. The wealthy planters became prized patrons of the hoteliers. When they brought their slaves with them, they expected their African Americans to perform such duties as valets, maids, and nurses. Peoples whose incomes depended on the slaveholding clientele made no fuss to the presence of slaves. Some innkeepers did not want to risk offending their rich customers. Others considered the matter a Southern issue for the South to handle, and did not therefore want to bring the debate about slavery to the Midwest. In addition, the presence of slaves in the hotels was only temporary. By the fall season, they would return with their masters to the South, and not become an awkward issue again for another 8 or 9 months, when the summer season once again arrived. Some travelers concerned themselves with how well the territorial government enforced the ordinance and the compromise. Some of them believed that a slave remained a slave in Minnesota Territory as long as the owner had control of the slave. As soon as a slave escaped from the slaveholder in the territory, the African American became emancipated. Although some people refused to travel upriver with their slaves at the risk of their escaping free land, others decided to take the gamble. An annual Winslow guest named Colonel Slaybeck, for example, resigned himself to the possibility of his slaves taking advantage of their legal emancipation upon setting foot in the Midwest. He always brought his family and slaves to the hotel. Each year he reminded his slaves upon arrival, "Now you are in the North, where they do not own slaves, and if you wish to escape, this is your chance to run away." But none of Slaybeck's slaves ever took advantage of Minnesota Territory's so-called free status. Instead, they returned to the South with him as slaves at the end of each annual vacation. Therefore, they did not see the territory as their promised land. They would not have had a significant population of African Americans with whom to socialize. They would have had to start new lives as their own people in an area in which European Americans restricted African Americans to the lowest paying positions of employment. They also risked returning to enslavement anyway after 1850 because of the fugitive slave law. Anyone could have captured them and sold them to a different master than Colonel Slaybeck. According to Cyrus Brooks, a resident of St. Anthony at the time, the locals generally assumed that all visiting slaves received legal counseling, similar to what Slaybeck annually told his property. Brooks did not say whether the townspeople believed that slaves had learned about Minnesota's free status from their owners or from other sources. He remembered that the residents had taken for granted the territory's anti-slavery reputation, and therefore had thought that slaves had only themselves to blame for remaining enslaved in Minnesota. The feeling of the citizens seemed to be, William Fletcher King recalled, that if slaves were so stupid that they did not desire liberty, it would not do much good if they had it. King himself expressed shock that despite the freedom he believed was legally given to slaves upon setting foot in the territory, still they appeared to choose to remain with their masters and to go back into slavery. But not every slave who came to the Midwest was ignorant about his or her legal status there. Several slaves who lived there temporarily with their owners sued for their freedom, when their owners forced them to return to the South. Many of the cases in which slaves argued that crossing into the Midwest had made them free were brought to court in Missouri. Although Missouri was a southern slaveholding state, its courts frequently found in favor of the slaves. Some of the more prominent judicial victories for slaves were Rachel versus Walker and Winnie versus Whitesides. Their successes were all the more impressive considering that not only could slaves not sue or serve on juries in many places at the time, but neither could women. Although Minnesota Territory was unique in its dependence on non-slaveholding migrants for maintaining slavery, more traditional means in the region, such as pro-slavery presidential appointments, still took place. In 1853, the newly inaugurated president, Franklin Pierce, a Democrat, appointed Willis Gorman to govern Minnesota because of his support of slavery. When Gorman had served as a congressman, he voted for the Fugitive Slave Bill. Gorman, in turn, followed Pierce's lead and appointed a pro-slavery Southern migrant named Sylvanus Lowry to the territorial government office of Adjutant General in May of 1853. African Americans in bondage in the Midwest generally did not have much incentive to attempt to escape to freedom, especially after the Supreme Court decided Dred Scott's fate. His owner had brought him from the South to Fort Snelling, where Scott married and started a family. Like Rachel and Winnie before him, Scott sued for his freedom too. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 by the Supreme Court only strengthened the premise of the fugitive slave law, that a slave remained an owner's property no matter where the slave relocated. Slaves in Minnesota and elsewhere in the Midwest not only had left their communities to come north, but they also had moved to a territory where their development of new kin networks was nearly impossible. In the South, kin networks allowed slaves to develop strong communities and provide effective distribution of information about current events in the city, state, and nation. However, too few African Americans lived in Minnesota Territory, and owners did not bring enough slaves for the kin networks to survive the relocation. One of Minnesota Territory's first tests of the Dred Scott decision took place within months of the verdict. Newspapers outside of the territory reported the incident, a development that showed how the territory was fostering a national reputation for tolerance of African-American slavery. In the late spring of 1857, a traveler from Tennessee and his slaves stopped for lodging at the Stearns house in St. Cloud. Someone made an attempt to help the slave escape from the slaveholder. However, according to the Chicago Daily Tribune, the law and order people turned out in great numbers and prevented the outrage upon our laws from being consummated. Local opponents of slavery, despite their commitments to civil disobedience, were not numerous enough to keep the institution from taking place. No underground railroad existed in central Minnesota. And just as a point of trivia for anyone who's curious about where the Stearns house used to be, it is where it was, where the Stewart Hall building and 51 building are there now. So if you want to get a sense of at least one of the locations where slavery was taking place here in town, then all you have to do is go to Stewart Hall. And there's a sign outside Stewart Hall that has a marker for the Stearns house as well. St. Cloud law enforcement protected the rights of the slaveholder in a supposedly free territory. The people embodying law and order in the city were supporters of Sylvanus Lowry, the first mayor of the city. The charter of St. Cloud authorized the mayor to call upon any male inhabitant of the town over 18 years of age to aid in enforcing the laws or carrying into effect any law or ordinance. Lowry's immediate successor as mayor was John Wilson, who shared his predecessor's support for the Democratic Party and therefore publicly supported many of his political decisions, even those that strengthened slavery. In addition, the Prussian immigrant Joseph Edelbrock, who had come to town by Lowry's invitation to become the postmaster in the 1850s, now served as the sheriff of Stearns County too. The St. Paul Times newspaper was especially vigilant about reporting the rash of legal claims to Minnesota's slavery. According to the paper, the presence of African Americans in bondage there now amounted to a considerable number. An article told of a local man who holds his gangs of slaves over on the Minnesota River, which he works upon his farm. He challenged the open hostility from the locals because of the Scott decision. Although not given a name, he was identified as a man of means who has once received a vote of his fellow Democrats for the legislature. Like Lowry, this slaveholder was a long-standing resident instead of a visitor. His use of slaves was atypical in that it involved agricultural labor instead of domestic service. This article noted that the wave of reports on slavery in the summer was just a continuation of similar and ongoing incidents from before that season. Just before the summer began, a Southerner paid for the use of more than one room at a first-class hotel in St. Paul. The other rooms went to his 5 slaves. He had signed the guest register with his name and servants. Even before then, men traveled through St. Paul with their slaves many times in the winter season. The travel by boat up the Mississippi River also made St. Paul a likely place to witness slavery. The city's newspaper mentioned that boats from St. Louis, Missouri were almost daily anchored at St. Paul's levee, and several of the boats from the southern city consisted of slave crews. Another story about upper Mississippi slavery reached the East Coast that same month. The Hartford Daily Courier noted a report in St. Anthony, Minnesota's periodical, about men now held as slaves as property in Minnesota. The article told of men traveling from the South bringing their body servants with them to the territory's hotels and returning to the South with their slaves. The report also announced that one Southern migrant with a permanent residence in Stillwater, Minnesota, kept a slave. The paper lamented that his permanence in the territory would render slavery a permanent institution in Minnesota. Also, the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case gave the slaveholder his legal justification for his actions. Under the Dred Scott decision, said the paper, he defies the authorities to intervene. After the Civil War began in 1861, the hotels that catered to vacationing Southerners lost business and went into decline. After more upper Mississippi communities harassed tourists and made attempts to free their slaves, slaveholders simply stopped visiting the area in order to avoid trouble and keep their human property. Meanwhile, as Southerners defended the Confederacy, they had little time or inclination to go to the Northwest for vacation. So, with slavery being over, that leads to the third immigration wave, African-American ex-slaves and the first freeborn. The first grand-scale voluntary migration by Southern African Americans began during the Civil War. Many of the sojourners left in order to seek northern refuge from racial violence and poverty. Almost all the participating adults were ex-slaves, and the migrants tended to leave in family units. In the early 1880s, St. Cloud became part of this national phenomenon. Indeed, by 1885, 2 African American families had settled in St. Cloud. Over the next 2 decades, the population of that ethnic group fluctuated between 10 and 15 people. Families came and went. However, the number of people in intact black families in St. Cloud outnumbered the number of individual black migrants from outside the city until about the early 19-teens. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, St. Cloud's African Americans led very similar lives to the African American population of the Twin Cities. For example, in both St. Paul and St. Cloud, African Americans found more employment in hotels than anywhere else. They tended to work as porters, waiters, and cooks. Also, in both cities, blacks lived in hotels, boarding houses, and private residences. The growing diversity of the population did not translate into equal opportunity for employment. In the 1880s, the railroad and granite industries provided the most jobs to people in St. Cloud in general. Unfortunately, new African American migrants did not work in either type of business in the city. Moreover, they did not work in any skilled capacity, but rather in service-oriented jobs. In contrast, African Americans in the Twin Cities were able to perform such skilled labor as cutting stones and laying bricks. The major difference between the Twin Cities and St. Cloud at the time had to do with the Twin Cities having had a consistent African American presence since the mid-1800s. With a larger and more permanent number of African Americans in the Twin Cities, African Americans developed strong communities. They started institutions such as lodges and African Methodist Episcopal churches. In contrast, with an inconsistent African American population in the single digits in the late 19th century, St. Cloud had much fewer African Americans, an unsurprising amount because the black community there was rebuilding from scratch. As a result, the strong sense of community and the African American institutions did not develop among African Americans in St. Cloud. Among the African American families in that city, the Websters, John and Lizzie, and their children Adelaide, Charles, Harry, and Ruby, moved there from Ohio in 1888. John worked as a barber for several St. Cloud hotels for the next 12 years. African Americans arriving in the city often worked for him before starting their own businesses. Edward Morris started working as his co-barber when he arrived in 1892, and David Bassfield worked for them when he moved there 7 years later. Meanwhile, the Webster children excelled in school. The St. Cloud Times made mention of Harry and Charles Webster's perfect attendance in 1892. One of the most notable aspects of St. Cloud's African Americans at the start of the 20th century is that the majority of the local African Americans were entrepreneurs. The city welcomed African American run businesses and supported them. Very few cities in the United States at the time had a remotely similar track record of African Americans accumulating such wealth. Even in the Twin Cities, the majority of African Americans were not independent business people. Of all the African American families in St. Cloud, only the Lee family had not started any business ventures, but the family members found jobs throughout the decade. In addition, St. Cloud was one of the few cities in the United States where the income of the African American households surpassed that of a significant number of European American households. Most African Americans nationwide were domestic servants or field laborers, and neither position by itself provided a living wage. Segregated schools and electoral disenfranchisement guaranteed that African Americans had little opportunity to improve their conditions or politically influence their communities. Also, the lynching of African Americans throughout the United States discouraged challenges to the status quo. So the progress of St. Cloud's African Americans in this era is no small achievement. Arguably, the most prosperous new arrivals were the members of the Bassfield family, Dave Bassfield, his wife Emma, and children Glenn and Leon. Dave Bassfield operated the first independent African American business in town, Dave Bassfield's Tonsorial Parlors. He ran the shop for 6 or 7 years before he and his family left the city in the middle of the decade. The Bassfield name itself had a great reputation. Dave's father, Titus Bassfield, was an ex-slave who later became a renowned staunch abolitionist. Dave Bassfield started the city's first black-run barber shop that was outside of a hotel. The shop was a family affair because Dave's son Glenn worked as an apprentice when he reached the age of 16. Dave advertised his business in the St. Cloud Times with a clever poem. When you wish an easy shave, as good as Baber ever gave, just call at my tonsorial room at eve or morn or busy noon. I'll cut and curl your hair with grace, the skin I'll leave all on your face. My room is neat and towels clean, scissors sharp and razors keen, and everything I think you'll find to suit the taste and please the mind. Bastfield's advertisement is especially significant because of its content. The 68 words of poetry demonstrate that he indulged in his advertisement. It's more humorous than most local business notices. It's also non-competitive because he did not describe his shop as better than any others, nor did he publicize the strengths of his own shop. He merely promised the basics of a clean and orderly facility. However, his advertisement entertained, as it pitched, which was the tool to attract customers. Also, at a time when blackface minstrels exploited African-American stereotypes of clownish apparel, stilted speech, and unkempt appearance, Bastfield prioritized promoting cleanliness, and that was an important challenge to the usual imagery of African Americans. The Bastfields ran into some difficult economic times before closing shop and leaving St. Cloud. The shop changed locations at least once. Also, the Bastfields moved out of their own home to live in the barber shop. They eventually relocated to Ohio, where Dave Bastfield died in 1929 at age 77. Edward Morris's barber shop began under tragic circumstances. When the 20th century started, he was still a barber for the West Hotel. Unfortunately, it burned down in 1901, and Morris lost his business and most of his furniture and clothes. Within a year, however, he rebuilt his business and his life. He set up his own shop and ran it until the end of the decade, when he left St. Cloud. As for John Webster, he set up an independent shop, and it broke from the usual labor for African Americans in the state, because in his new facility, he did not cut hair, nor did he shine shoes. Instead, he cleaned and dyed clothes. He opened his business around 1901 and kept it open in St. Cloud for the next 15 years. His daughter, Ruby Webster, also excelled here in the city. In the spring of 1908, she became one of the first African-American high school graduates in the city. That September, she entered St. Cloud State Normal School, what we now call St. Cloud State University. In most of her classes, she received the equivalent of a B grade. Some grades were C's, and her highest grade, an A- equivalent, was for a drawing class. No professor gave her the highest grade, excellent, which corresponds to the A grade. Still, she became one of the institution's first African-American graduates 9 months later. She earned a one-year elementary education degree, and she committed herself to teaching in the state for the first 2 years after her graduation, which was a pledge that all normal school students had to make back then. She also appeared with her fellow graduates in a class photograph from 1909. The south side of St. Cloud emerged as a principal living and business area of local African Americans and remained so throughout the following decade. This development exemplified the nationwide responses of urban European American communities to increasing numbers of African American migrants during the early 20th century. European Americans barred African Americans from certain neighborhoods, forcing them into clusters. For a year or so, the businesses of John Webster and Dave Bastfield were only one street apart. At the turn of the century, the Lees and the Bastfields lived on the same street, 9th Avenue South. The close proximity of the families was good for the children because quite a few of them were of the same age. In 1900, Arthur Lee, Leon Bastfield, and Emma Webster were either 6 or 7 years old, and 12-year-old Ruby Webster was only 1 year older than Glenn Bastfield and 2 years older than Edward Lee. African Americans faced more limitations in the world of sports than in business. Between 1901 and 1903, 2 African Americans, Walter Ball and George Wilson, played baseball for St. Cloud. They played for a local semi-professional team. The city's newspapers praised the players for their athletic skills. However, when the issue of establishing a professional team emerged in the 1900s, St. Cloud did not want African American players on such a team. For all the prosperity of local African Americans, cultural images of African Americans in the city instead reflected contemporary stereotypes. Blackface minstrel shows were a constant source of amusement. Groups ranging from prison inmates to women's social clubs wore burnt cork on their faces, and they sang plantation songs during most of the city's first century. In addition, in a town council meeting in 1907, it would be possible to hear an alderman use a popular but a crude phrase like, "There's a nigger in the fence," which means that someone proposing an idea has a hidden motive for doing so. Around the same time, a major sporting event revealed the ethnic tension that lay below the surface here in town. Jack Johnson, the African-American boxing champion, was defending his title against Jim Jeffries, who was promoted as the Great White Hope. Although the fight was held in Nevada, the St. Cloud Times received bulletins about the match as it progressed. And then a staff member would share each update with the crowd that gathered outside the St. Cloud Times building. Here is how the St. Cloud Times covered the boxing match. The headline is, "Racial feeling was intense. Local people, one and all, favored the white man in the fight. Reports from Reno show that the colored troops fought nobly." It has been generally supposed that racial feeling was bonded by Mason and Dixon's line, and that the sympathies of the public north of that historical boundary were with the black man, for whom, incidentally, many a white northern boy and man fought in the days gone by. It was seen Monday afternoon, however, that the color line does not end with the growth of peanuts and yams, but that it extends up toward where Perry camped 2 years ago when he planted the stars and stripes where it had never floated before. When the bulletins came in from far off Reno, the crowds gathered in front of the Times building, and the expression of feeling was very pronounced. There was not one who had placed any money on the black man, not a one who wished he would win. It was Jeffries all the time, and when the indications were for a time that he had Johnson on the run, shouts rent the air. But the feeling was entirely different when the 15th round. The short but intense message came in. Johnson wins in the 15th round. There was consternation among the onlookers, and it is doubtful that the colored man would have escaped from the crowd had one been there. So it's in these particularly tense times below the surface that we come to the fourth immigration wave, which is that of strikebreakers. St. Cloud became part of a wave of northern African-American migration during the mid-1900s. From 1914 to 1917, some 5,000 to 10,000 African-Americans migrated from the south to the north each month. Some of them sought to escape the rigid segregation, while others were exiled as cotton farming became more mechanized, or the boll weevil destroyed crops. When a small fraction of these migrants arrived in St. Cloud in the next few years, the town did not welcome them with open arms. For example, the locals did not support Great Northern Railroad's decision to ship between 16 and 20 African Americans from St. Paul to St. Cloud to work at the depot in July of 1916. The larger quantity of African Americans generated considerable controversy among European American citizens. The Times noted that Great Northern's transferal doubled the city's African American population. An anti-African American bias immediately developed, reporting that some of the migrants refused to handle scrap iron and only wanted to truck it. One newspaper considered the complaint usual with their race when confronted with the actual horror of real work. One of the points of contention focused on labor. A spokesman for Great Northern announced that St. Cloud suffered a labor shortage. As a result, the company had to bring in workers from outside the city to load and unload lumber at the Great Northern shops. Local labor union officials begged to differ. They said that plenty of men in St. Cloud were unemployed and willing to work. Also, the union spokesman partially blamed the train company itself for the unemployment problem. It seems to me, he said, that the Great Northern laid off 125 men at the shops not long ago. And here is the way that the St. Cloud Times reported the arrival of these strikebreakers. From July 28, 1916, the headline is, "Car of Negroes arrive here to work at shops." Ethiopians, that was a synonym for African Americans back then, engaged in loading and unloading lumber by road, 20 of them to be given steady employment around yards. Officials say it is done because of a shortage of workmen. A carload of between 16 and 20 Negroes was imported here by the Great Northern Railroad last night for work in the shops. The Negroes were brought here from St. Paul, it said. It is reported at the shops that the men will be employed in loading and unloading lumber at the shops, and they will be given steady employment. The shortage of labor compels us to resort to this measure, an employee of the company said today, in answering the question by the Times. We have been unable to employ sufficient workmen in this city for the work, and we are compelled to employ them. He was asked if the Negroes would be used regularly at the shops. Yes, if they will stay here, he answered. They will work out in the yards and loading and unloading lumber. If the arrangement is satisfactory, they likely will be retained. The doubling of the African American population in St. Cloud led European Americans to believe that African Americans were robbing their homes. The Times reported the perceived trend, but only used a few eyewitness accounts. Also, the witnesses did not actually see African Americans stealing any property. Instead, one person saw an African American man enter a house without a knock while the family sat in the parlor. Another woman heard a noise in her home but thought the commotion had come from her children. She later saw a window screen removed and one of her husband's suits missing. The newspaper proclaimed that some locals considered that that's the work of the Negroes. However, by publicizing the incidents without stressing that the comments were hypotheses lacking factual proof to strengthen them, the Times became an accomplice to the spreading of anti-African American sentiment in St. Cloud. Still, African Americans kept coming here and to Minnesota at large. Businesses needed their labor, especially after the United States entered World War I. As European Americans left their jobs at the home front to fight on the war front, African Americans rushed northward to see if employers would fill the vacancies with them. They came in much greater numbers than those who had first left the South 1 or 2 generations earlier. They came to settle all over the state. But many communities still did not welcome them. Skin color discrimination was so prevalent in the state that at times local citizens had to be reminded of Minnesota's unique protection of the civil rights of African Americans. The state was one of very few to have an anti-discrimination law in place before the start of the 20th century. However, some parts of St. Cloud openly segregated by race as late as 1915. In that year, an African American merely took legal action to protest his mistreatment. He had gone to a restaurant to eat, but the manager told him to return at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when most of the customers would have left. When the African American man returned, the manager forced him to eat in a separate, undesirable portion of the restaurant. The customer reached his limit of tolerance when the manager charged him 10 extra cents for eating in the segregated area. The African American man withdrew his legal complaint after a conference, which was fortunate for the manager, because breaking the anti-discrimination law carried a heavy sentence, and a civil suit could have followed the criminal action. Although romantic relationships between people of different skin colors were not illegal in the state, the prohibition of them was an unspoken, understood rule in St. Cloud. In 1917, James Boozer, an African-American porter at the Nemec Theater, paid for breaking this rule. He secretly dated a European-American woman for a short while. When the relationship was discovered, Boozer lost his job, and the local police exiled him from St. Cloud. The Times covered the story in a rather insensitive manner. Because of Boozer's first name and his skin color, the paper named the exile after Mark Twain's African-American character from Tom Sawyer. The headline alone, "Nigger Jim Gets Walking Papers," showed the paper's bias against Boozer. The article described the allegations in minstrel dialect. Local saccharine baby, another synonym for African-American, got to fool around with the white gal. The paper made no mention of the fact that Boozer was ordered out of town despite having not committed an actual crime. Even worse, when townspeople warned of lynching him, the Times gave the matter little consideration. And the information appears in the story in one sentence. Some of the white men heard of the affair and threatened to treat Jim to a necktie party if he did not cease his attentions. The relationship continued to make headlines even after Boozer was forced out of town. A few months later, the Journal Press newspaper reported that Boozer and the white gal, Catherine Tierk, had married in St. Paul. Tierk's lawyer, Harry Rauch, immediately demanded a retraction, saying that Boozer had applied for and received a marriage license, but that Ms. Tierk did not consent to marrying him. The lawyer noted she did not marry him, did not intend to, and does not intend to. The attorney stressed the importance of this retraction, saying, "You can really understand what it means to have an article of that kind published in our hometown." The newspaper retracted. These developments were a far cry from what the Midwest was like just a century earlier, with people of different heritages and colors having open relationships. The color-segregated society of the second and third immigration waves had definitely left their imprint. Ironically, this same newspaper had once respected Boozer because of his patriotism. He had responded to his draft notice only 5 months earlier. The newspaper proudly listed him among those who registered with the Selective Service immediately after the United States officially entered World War I. However, However, in the reports about his affair, the press did not portray him as an African-American ready to give his life for his country, if called. Instead, he was just the Sacklin baby, nigger Jim, and also a dusty lover. For months after the Brewster incident, the local press gave African Americans little respect when covering them. Stories about African American criminal suspects featured crude writing, such as the minstrel dialect. Billy Lee, the oldest black resident and one of the pioneers of the 1880s, did not escape this treatment. The newspaper displayed amusement that another African American had attacked Lee with an axe instead of a razor. Even the most prominent African American family in St. Cloud was unable to survive in this openly hostile climate. After John and Lizzie Webster's children moved away, the cloth dyeing business survived for a few more years. John moved his store at least twice during the 19-teens. Between 1910 and 1913, his business had the distinction of sharing the same land as one of St. Cloud's 5 old structures, a log building built by early settler George Overbeck. But by 1916, Webster had lost his shop, and he became an employee for the cold storage company at age 65. He died 2 years later. However, unlike the local press's references to other African Americans by the N-word and the writings in dialect, the obituaries for Webster did not even mention his ethnicity, so the city remembered and respected the Webster family's achievements. Shortly after Webster's death, his wife Lizzie fell ill and moved to their daughter Adelaide's home in St. Paul, where Lizzie died in 1923. Between the 1920s and 1940s, African Americans in St. Cloud experienced some lean years. None of the members of the original founding African American families of the 1880s were left in the city. The new migrants had no old mentors from whom they could seek advice on surviving in St. Cloud as African Americans. Unlike the first 2 decades of the 20th century, successful entrepreneurs and athletes desegregating sports teams after 1920 were very few and far between. While open hostility in St. Cloud toward African Americans was starting to disappear, local African Americans were still too few in number to form a strong community capable of developing social and economic strength. In many respects, the residents of this period, like those from the 1880s, were rebuilding the local African American community from scratch after the terrible events of the 19-teens. Very few African American women lived in St. Cloud. No single African American woman migrated here at this time, and widows like Lizzie Webster generally left the city after their husbands died. African American women rarely worked outside the home. Those who worked found jobs outside of the city. At the time that longtime resident Bertha Major died in 1952, she had worked as a maid in Wayzata. The majority of the African American male population in St. Cloud worked as porters, a far cry from the African American business owners that were almost all of the African Americans in town in the 1900s. It was typical for African Americans in St. Cloud to live in the city for over 20 years and never find any other job besides that of a porter or a custodian. For example, Walt Major lived in St. Cloud from the 19-teens until his death in 1930 and had always worked as a porter. His nephew Walter followed suit after he arrived in the late 1920s. He took various porter positions until ill health forced his retirement in the 1940s. Meanwhile, Nelson Carwell worked in similar positions during the same decades, most consistently for the barber W.A. Winner from 1922 until Carwell died in 1949. The porters were well liked in the city. In their obituaries, both Major and Carwell received positive remembrances from local citizens. One person commented on the racelessness of Carwell. He eulogized Carwell as a white colored man because the porter never complained or asked anything of anyone. The notice of his death in the Times also mentioned the porter's deep religious faith and his membership of the Catholic Church. In fact, a local Catholic church hosted his funeral. Despite their inability to penetrate the local business sector beyond porter jobs, St. Cloud's African Americans could at least claim that they did not have to deal with the violence that erupted in Duluth in 1920. To be sure, in recent years, European Americans in St. Cloud have made some lynching threats to their African American neighbors. Still, unlike the Duluth mob, no one followed through with the threats in St. Cloud. In addition, after African American men were lynched in Duluth, the lynching threats in St. Cloud quickly tapered off, and the local press finally stopped referring to blacks as the N-word and stopped quoting them in the minstrel dialect. Still, African American migration had slowed to a trickle. After decades of migration by free African Americans, they were still coming largely as single men, and they failed to establish long-term businesses of their own. Only after the 1950s, with the opening of work in the Veterans Administration Hospital and loosening of international immigration controls in 1965, St. Cloud and Minnesota at large finally allowed African Americans and recent African immigrants throughout the state to settle and repopulate for generations. They finally had roots. This time I'll take any questions people have.
Thank you very much.
I don't need a mic, but I would like very much for Professor Lehman to make that paper available to us. Marvelously full of information. Thank you.
I'd be happy to.
We can also put that up on our website, the research group's website.
Oh. So this is really, really fascinating to me. Is this on? Yeah. I'm a sociologist, and so I'm trying to think about the larger trends in society that were influencing what was going on in St. Cloud in the period that you're talking about, especially the, I guess, the third and fourth waves of African American migration. Do you see the St. Cloud population of African Americans as sort of an outpost of the Twin Cities population, or were they kind of a standalone population and very idiosyncratic, or how are they connected to our larger trends beyond the, I guess, some of the labor forces you mentioned?
I didn't find a whole lot that suggested that African Americans who migrated here after the Civil War tried their luck in the Twin Cities first and just went northward. I think they came directly to St. Cloud from wherever they had been in the South or elsewhere. But because the Twin Cities had more time to develop a free community of African Americans, the more likely choice for African American migrants would be to just stay in the Twin Cities as opposed to going any further north. And for a good 4 or 5 decades, roughly from the 1880s to the 1920s, the African American population in St. Cloud never really got that much above 30. And it was just barely scraping the double digits by 1900. So even though it's a very small fraction of the population, because the fourth immigration wave doubled the African American numbers from 15 to 30, that still scared a lot of people. And unfortunately, there had just not been any continuation of people, or rather any continuation of families. If anyone gave birth to people here, then the children didn't stay. So once the parents died off, then that was the end of that family line in St. Cloud. So it's really since the 1950s or 1960s that African American families have regenerated in St. Cloud. Otherwise, in all the time since, the African American population was by nature temporary, with the slaves who were traveling with their tourists who were masters, or with the different families and single men who came and went.
Thank you.
I was here in St. Cloud in 1989, and those black Minnesotans who had some experience living in St. Paul that you mentioned in your presentation, in St. Cloud, with regard to race relations, they described it as night and day. Right? St. Cloud being the night. In terms of a real hostility. When I moved here, it was like I was going back 2 or 3 decades to the 1950s. Eisenhower years, great clothes, you know, like the Leap of the Beaver.
Hold the mic up, please. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I was just describing my experience. I've lived in the city for 23 years, and when we first arrived, there were very few black people in the city. This was pre the wave of Somalis, and I was contrasting the experience of blacks who had experience of living in St. Paul and visiting St. Cloud, and I described it as the difference, their experience, their perception as being the difference between night and day. In other words, that they experience St. Cloud as being a very uptight, very hostile kind of environment. And that was my experience too. It was like when the first sort of significant or countable number of blacks came, it was like the police went on all alert. It was like the community felt that, the white community felt it was being invaded because they perceived black folks as a bad element, as a criminal element, like the kind of attitudes that you described early on in terms of the typical kind of attitudes. And also the reports in the St. Paul Times, I mean, almost every other day there's coverage and always a picture of a black person, you know, like some criminal, some thieves. So that kind of tradition still continues. But there is, as you pointed out, the attitudes throughout the state are kind of uneven, but St. Cloud in particular has a very, very racist history and attitudes. And we still have to struggle with those attitudes in the police department and others present.
There's a lot of people and organizations trying to create change in St. Cloud, trying to make positive changes, and I had no idea the extensive history in St. Cloud. And so given that it goes so far back, any insights, input on how, given this extensive history, how do we try and create positive change?
Well, speaking as an educator, I've always believed that if people are just made aware of their surroundings and the history behind them, then they're less likely to have attitudes that are based on stereotypes. I mean, if this person who had this mistaken notion that African Americans had only lived here in town for 4 decades had known of the truth, then she wouldn't have been able to say what she said, because in her mind, African Americans were only a recent phenomenon. But if she had any idea about how long African Americans had been here, in fact, with the slaves dating back to 1854, there were African Americans here before many European immigrants were here. And I believe one of the slaves was born in Minnesota, was born in St. Cloud in 1857. So that's well before quite a few European immigrant groups even got into town. So if people thought of African Americans as fundamentally a part of St. Cloud's history as opposed to this group of recent invaders, then I think that right there would go a long way toward having people rethink about where they come from.
Dr. Lehman, thank you for your presentation. Would you please also enlighten us about some aspect of the story of a lady called James Swisshelm, who I believe about 4 or 5 years ago there was a controversy here on campus about a marker which commemorated this so-called great woman, and the marker was removed because of some position she had taken in the past. Could you please speak a little bit about it?
Yes, Jane Grace Wilson came here to St. Cloud in 1857, and she was a very strong abolitionist. She very much believed that slavery was wrong and that slavery needed to go away. So when she started her newspaper here, what she would do is call out slaveholders and criticized them in print, especially St. Cloud's mayor, Sylvanus Lowry. And one of the things that Lowry tried to do was to start his own newspaper, which he ironically called the Union because it was actually a pro-Confederate paper. And eventually the Union evolved into the St. Cloud Times that we have today. But one thing about Swisshelm is that even though a lot of people celebrate her for her abolitionism, she was also very staunchly against the indigenous population. And her comments in print and her actions during the war in 1862 sort of, well, they don't sort of tarnish, they tarnish whatever perfect mythological image that people have of her, and they portray her as human instead. And so Swisshelm, like people in general, are complicated. And that it is possible to be very much pro-abolition, but also anti-indigenous at the same time. That just because you want African Americans to be free doesn't mean that you want all minorities to have fair treatment and equality.
Dr. Lehman, I have a question about, you mentioned the job of being a porter, and that was a common job. I wonder if does that mean being a Pullman porter, being a member of that union, or does that mean working in trucking, or what exactly kind of jobs were porter jobs?
Well, you could be a porter for a train. You could also be a porter at different hotels, someone who would show people to their rooms or carry their luggage. But anyone who was involved in some kind of service industry that involved travelers, I think porter would apply to those kinds of positions.
Were any of the Pullman union at that time? That was too early.
I don't know for certain. I haven't come across any specifically.
Any overriding conclusion after all this wonderful research that you have for us as we finish up?
Well, I just encourage people wherever they settle to learn about wherever it is that you're going to live, because sometimes the history that makes up a certain community is right in front of your face, even if people don't talk about it. And just by spending a couple minutes at a library or at a town archive will make you more aware than some of your neighbors. And then you can pass that information along, and you can have a more informed community.
I see it's about 10:45 right now. Oh, there's another question, okay. Let's take one more question.
Just a
Oh.
comment. I was an intern here. I commuted from the cities, 1961 to 63. And our evaluation of the community was, they roll up the sidewalks at 5 p.m. I saw no other person of color. Take that back. There was an Asian who was also an intern at the VA during that time. I moved here in 1980, and I think there were about 100, and I could be wrong, I'd like for you to correct me, 100 African Americans. And I understand there are about 800 now. The population of the city is 65 to 70,000 people. What percentage and what influence do we have?
Well, it's hard to quantify, but I guess I could say that in the 10 years that I've been here, it's definitely been growing. And when I was hired, it was principally to start the work in facilitating an African American Studies minor. And by 2006, that was in the books. And different African American community organizations have developed in that time as well. There are also a lot more African American run businesses that are here in town than there were 10 years ago. And so the African American presence is more visible in the public eye, and African American contributions are also more outly open. And you don't necessarily have to read a history book to to get all the contributions because they're happening every day as well. We just have to know where to look.